Welcome to Unraveling the Middle East, where scholars answer questions about the seemingly incomprehensible and at times impossible region, this cradle of civilization. So, who are the peoples of the Middle East? What is it about them and their roots that we don't get? What lessons do they have for us and for themselves? The answers are told in scholarly accounts of the history, myths, and mysteries of the Middle East. Tales and takes you haven't heard before. And I'm Adel Ali, your host. In this two-part episode, how successful diplomacy worked in the ancient Middle East, and personal stories from 500,000 clay tablets, from acts of kindness to careers, to family tragedies, to beer parties. So please join me and my guest, Dr. Amanda Podany, as we unravel the Middle East. Dr. Podany, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. In this segment, I want to speak with you about the Middle East in the context of your book, which is titled Brotherhood of Kings: How International Relations Shaped the Ancient Near East. Let's start with the title of your book. I'm just curious, by Near East in the title, do you mean the Middle East?
Yes, it's just a long-standing tradition, for whatever reason, that people who study the ancient Middle East called it the ancient Near East. And now, just in the past few years, that there's been pushback on that. And I think increasingly we are referring to it as the ancient Middle East. For clarity, it just is more obvious, if
Yeah.
that's the region of the world we're talking about. I think this goes all the way back to the 19th century, the term ancient Near East. And it's even abbreviated in my field as ANE. It's just so familiar. But there's been a recognition that we need to change it. So yes, it is the ancient Middle East, and I increasingly refer to it as such.
So, in the ancient Middle East, what countries would you include? What modern countries would you uh, uh, include in that region?
It's interesting how that can be defined in many different ways. My own
And by the way,
personal,
if I may interrupt you, I asked that question in the context of the thousands, I do literally mean thousands of comments that I get on social media about a simple term, the Middle East.
absolutely. For me, when I
Mhm.
do my books, mostly I focus on the region of the Middle East that used the cuneiform writing system, which may seem like a sort of
Oh,
arbitrary division, but it really isn't, because when the writing system was in cuneiform on clay tablets, there was a shared culture in some ways between those regions, and that would include what is now Iraq, what is now Turkey, uh, for some period of time, what is now Iran and Syria, uh, Lebanon sometimes. But so for me, in a way, it makes sense to study that region as my central focus, partly because I read cuneiform and I
yeah.
don't read glyphs. And I'm not expert in Egyptian history, even though, of course, one would include Egypt in the Middle East. One would include many other regions in the Middle East today.
The Arabian Peninsula. Yeah.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. I'm so
Um,
glad I asked that question because it really puts our conversation in the context of your research, the geographic areas that you focus on. Your book covers 1,000 year period from 2300 BC to 1300 BC. This was the age before empires. Am I correct?
Absolutely, yes. Well, there were sort of attempts at empire during.
Attempts. Okay.
Yes, they certainly, all the way back in 2300 BCE, there'd been a king named Sargon who had this goal of ruling the entire world. Um, but they weren't terribly successful at it until much later. The empires tended to sort of survive a very short time, maybe a single king's reign, and then they would collapse. It wasn't really until the Neo-Assyrian kings around the 10th century BCE that they developed a system that really worked for maintaining a large empire that extended over an enormous area. So there's a sort of sense that the earlier empires, in sort of air quotes,
Mhm.
uh, were not empires in the way we would define them in subsequent history. They had this interesting. It's fascinating that that Sargon so early on developed this idea that one man might rule the whole world. And later kings would sort of claim to control the four quarters of the universe. But clearly they didn't.
They
And
didn't,
it's a
yeah.
real struggle to hold on to it. Whereas once you get to the Assyrians, followed by the Neo-Babylonians, followed by the Persians, followed by Hellenistic Greeks and the Romans and so forth in this region, there really were huge empires that ruled massive amounts of space. But in this earlier period, I think what's so fascinating is that hadn't developed yet. And so we have these kingdoms that were, I think, very different in a way from those later empires.
Does that matter to your analysis?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
In what context?
Well, because my interest in writing that book was in two ways. It was looking at all kinds of contacts between ancient regions, and not just within the Middle East. I was also looking at contacts with, for example, the Indus Valley, um, contacts, even in some cases, right across Europe to get amber. But most of them were within the Middle East. And the contacts were sometimes trade contacts, but they were very often diplomatic contacts. And so there's, in this period, nobody had a military that was big or impressive enough to go off and conquer hundreds of miles from home. You know, they were going to be really confined to an area relatively close to the capital city that they could actually control. And so when it came to interactions with other regions, you get this development of a really sophisticated diplomatic system for having engaged contact with distant regions. And between the trade and the diplomacy, and to some extent warfare, which is also in the book, you find that there's this influx of really important influences from across the region that, as I say, I think really shaped the ancient world in that time period.
Is that why you call it a pivotal region? Did it shape the future of the Middle East in some ways?
I think it did, yes. I think it also is often a surprise to people. I think that this is a period that isn't very well known. And there's often an assumption, I certainly find it among my students, that not just in the Middle East, but across the world, they have this assumption that the earlier you look, the more sort of violent things were. It's that old image of
Yeah, that's what you hear on TV,
yeah,
whatever. Yeah.
and you know, nasty, brutish, and short. That's how
Exactly.
it was at the beginnings of culture in the traditional conception, and it's just not true. Life was short. That part is true. You know, obviously, right up until modern medicine, life was traditionally short. But nasty and brutish, not really. I mean, what's so surprising is that as soon as you get the development of urban culture, and as soon as you get writing and kings writing about war, you get those same kings writing about diplomacy. That it's not as though diplomacy developed
That's
hundreds of years
fascinating.
later. Yeah, no, it's right there at the beginning.
So, how did diplomacy succeed back then? I know there were wars. I mean, we're humans. There will always be wars, but overall, in that period, diplomacy worked based on your telling of this history. Why do you think it worked? Is it because armies were smaller, militaries were less capable?
I think it's a couple of reasons. One is that they seem to have really sought for peace from very early on. And this is before the period really, my book is it's 2300 to 1300, but it really focuses on the last 100 years of that. But at the beginning, in 2300, you know, kings are just beginning to write letters, inscriptions. We're beginning to see writing being used for something other than just administration, 2400 or so. And one gets this sudden picture as soon as they're writing letters, as soon as they're recording things that aren't just administrative, of a whole system that existed with envoys who would travel from one city to another, who would bring gifts, who would be treated well in the court that they traveled to. So the system existed before they were writing about it, or before the documents that we have, which means that we don't see its development. The very earliest diplomatic letter, which was found at Ebla in Syria, reflects a system that's already in place. You know, it's not something where we can see it gradually coming into being through early letters.
The
They
letter is not talking about ushering of an era. It's talking about something that's already been happening.
Yeah, they just assume that the envoys are going to come and they're going to bring gifts, and there's going to be a letter that's going to be exchanged, and that there's already the term that the kings are brothers of one another, which they weren't. They weren't blood brothers, but this idea that you were the brother of your ally, that continued throughout this period. That was just the term for an ally. He was your brother. And it's right there in the very first letter. And so this was a system that had developed before they were writing about it. So we don't know exactly how it developed, but we can see the benefits of it once it existed, because it gave the kings and their countries access to goods from foreign lands that they weren't going in and fighting for. The first letter, which was to a king of Hamazi, it was so far from Ebla. There's absolutely no way the army of Ebla would show up in Hamazi and raid them.
Where's Hamazi? You said Abla
It's
is
in Iran.
in.
It's all the way off in Iran, and Ebla's in Western Syria. So very, very great distance between them. And the king of Hamazi and the king of Ebla were in contact with one another, and they were sending each other gifts. And these gifts were luxury goods that they had in their respective kingdoms that they could then get access to through this diplomatic relationship. And right from the beginning, diplomacy had a lot of purposes. Diplomacy with your neighbor was so that you could perhaps avert war. Diplomacy with your distant ally was very often so that you could get stuff. I mean, there was a very pragmatic reason for it.
Trade.
Yeah. But it's interesting because it is trade in a way, except that it's more of a luxury gift exchange, because with trade, you expect receipts, you expect a price, you expect, you will pay me on such and such a day. This was it was just an agreement. It was, I will send you something, and I expect something of equal value in return, but there's nothing holding you to that except that we are allies. Do you see?
Okay. I just want to make sure I appreciate the significance of these luxury good exchanges. They were not, neither party seems to be the vassal of the other party, inferior.
Right.
Because that's significant. For example, if we fast forward to China's imperial history, they received a lot of gifts, but these were tributes, if you will. So that's different, but this is not that.
Right. This isn't tribute. There were certainly gifts that a vassal would send to his overlord. That would happen. And sometimes the overlord would send a gift back. So it's not, there was no luxury gift exchange between lords and vassals. But in the case of equal kings, the assumption was that you would send something very valuable and you would get something of absolute equal value in exchange. And there's a very interesting letter from, in the 18th century BCE. So long after this Ebla letter, which establishes the earliest we know, where a king writes to another king, they're equals, they're allies, and he says, this is something we should not speak about, but basically I have to say this. I sent you beautiful horses, and you sent me tin in exchange. And he says, this is not how a brother treats a brother. This is an insult. You are, had you sent me nothing, I would have been fine. It would have just been a gift. But you sent me tin? This is just terrible. Who are you?
Tin as in the metal, Tin? Yeah.
Yes. Oh. I mean, he sent a number of minas of tin. It was apparently where he lived, he felt this was the value of the horses he received. But the place he sent it to, it was like, these horses are worth X number of, I forget exactly the details, so many minas of silver, and you send me this measly tin. He was just so mad. But usually...
Was there a reply from that?
No, we don't know what he replied. We just have the one letter.
That is amazing.
But yeah, there was a subtext, but I love the fact that king says, this is something we never talk about. I am having to say this because you have driven me to this, but we don't talk about this. Great kings just know that you send something that is equivalent. So this
is established tradition.
Yes.
We don't talk about it because you should know this.
Exactly. Yeah.
That is fascinating. You use the term envoy several times, right? In our modern parlance, what you hear on whatever Fox News, CNN, whatever you listen to, you watch, envoy doesn't have a sense of permanence to it. It's not an ambassador, right? So explain this term, please.
The actual term they used was Mars Shipri, which literally means son of the road.
Huh.
Which suggests, that is just about the person who is traveling. I am traveling on the road. I am the son of the road. And so we're trying to figure out, is this just a messenger? Is this just someone who's carrying the message? And sometimes they were. Sometimes it was somebody whose entire job was just to carry the document from one court to the other. But some of these men were ambassadors in the sense that they went regularly. The same man would go repeatedly, but they weren't ambassadors in the sense that they lived there. When you think of an ambassador to a country, that's someone who's in residence.
Hmm.
These were not people who were in residence in the country they were traveling to. They were envoys in the sense that they were traveling to the kingdom. They would stay there until the message came back from the king who they were visiting, and then they would travel back to their home court. So they went back and forth, but they were very high powered. The ones who were actually responsible for reading the message, and also actually negotiating with the king beyond what was in the letter. So they would bring a letter from their king. It would be read to the foreign king. Then they would answer questions. The king would have questions. Well, what does your king mean about this? And they had the authority to really negotiate on behalf of their king. Because you got to think, they are traveling for months to get sometimes from one place to another, especially later in this period around from 1420 onwards for a couple of hundred years. They were traveling maybe from Egypt to Mesopotamia, or Mesopotamia to Egypt, or from Anatolia to what is now Turkey to what is now Iraq. They're traveling long, long distances. They can't really say, hold that thought, I'll go check with my king.
Let me
Travel for
text
several
him.
months,
Yeah.
come back, right. There's no way over that distance that they can have any communication with their king after they've left. And so they are really the eyes and ears, but also the voice of the king. And he's trusting them to perhaps engage in negotiations over a peace treaty, maybe determining a particular point of conflict between the two kingdoms. So this is someone who's much more than a son of the road. He's much more than the traveling guy who brings the tablet.
Much more than a mere messenger.
Much more than a mere messenger,
Yeah.
but he's not an ambassador in residence. So I feel like envoy is a good translation, but it's
Yeah. No, I'm glad you clarified that. Dr. Podany, you pick this 1,000-year period and you focus on the um, last century of it in particular. But I take it the reason that you pick this period and you call it pivotal is because this diplomacy and the peace it effectuated has some permanence to it, right?
yeah. Yeah, I think I was initially going to write just about the late Bronze Age, the period from 1500 to 1200,
Mm-hmm.
when I first was thinking about the book, because that is an international age of really um, a remarkable period of peace for the most part. But then I realized that in order to make sense of that, you have to understand the periods that led up to it, and the fact that this whole diplomatic system that they used in that period to maintain peace across a very large area had developed, as I say, all the way back in the 24th century BCE. And it was the same system that they were using, but gradually they were using it over a wider and wider area with greater and greater effect. So I included, the book has three sort of eras that I look at, and I look at one king in particular as a sort of case study
Mm-hmm.
in each era. And for the kingdom of Ebla, I look at a king named Irkab-Damu. For the period of the uh, what's called the Old Babylonian period, which was the time of Hammurabi, I look at a king named Zimri-Lim. These are all Syrian kings, by the way. And then in the third period, I look at a king named Tushratta.
Assyrian or
Oh,
Syrian?
Syrian, starting with an S, yes, in
Okay.
Syria.
Okay.
A king named Tushratta, who was the king of a kingdom named Mitanni, who was part of this big international period. And I chose them because they were ruling more or less in the same area, but in these three different eras. We have evidence for diplomacy during each one of their kingdoms. And I thought it would be interesting to have the three of them as sort of touchstones, if you will, for to understand what was going on in their different eras. But of course, there were lots and lots of kings involved. Those were just the three I chose to focus on.
Does the permanence of this diplomacy include anything else? I'm speaking from my memory. I read about your book several days ago. Relationships, bonds, marriages?
Oh, yes, absolutely. The system, as it developed, and the system that existed right from the beginning, sort of had five parts to it.
Five
One
parts.
was this exchange of envoys. So allies would exchange envoys, and they would do it regularly. By the time one gets to the late period where they're traveling over very long distances, sometimes it might be only once a year that they got to the allies' court, but they were, it was something that was expected. Your envoys would travel back and forth.
So
And that
communication.
communication. But part of what those envoys would do would be to bring actual letters on clay tablets written in cuneiform between the two kings. So they weren't just giving a sort of oral report to the king of what the other king had said. They had a written document that was associated with it. And those documents, for much of this era, were written in the lingua franca, which was the language of Akkadian. Akkadian being the language that was spoken in southern Mesopotamia, or Mesopotamia, most of Mesopotamia, throughout much of this era. So Akkadian was the lingua franca. They would take these letters. So that's the second one.
So these letters on clay tablets are formal communications.
Yes. They are from one king to the other.
Yeah.
In fact, they would say, thus says such and such a king, speak to, and then they would name
And
the
when
king.
you say lingua franca, that's like King of Sweden speaking with another king who's not German, both of them speaking German, or both of them speaking French. That's their lingua franca.
Exactly.
That's what you mean. Okay.
Yes. So the kings who were writing to one another, in many cases, Akkadian wasn't the native language of either of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
They would use it because it was the accepted language to write in.
Got it. So one, envoys.
Right. One, envoys, two, letters.
Mm-hmm.
Third part is gifts. That it was very important right from the beginning that gifts be sent. And that's why I think that right from the beginning, a big part of the king's investment in this was getting stuff, getting luxury things from places that otherwise he had no contact with.
Yeah.
So he might be getting a particular kind of beautiful wood, or he might be getting a particular metal, or he might be getting lapis lazuli, the beautiful blue stone that they all appreciated. In exchange, he would be sending whatever luxury good his country has. And in Mesopotamia, they had incredibly beautiful textiles, apparently, that none of which survive.
Wow, that's a shame.
But they were so famous for these textiles. Egypt had gold. So once Egypt was part of this system, everybody wanted gold from Egypt. But there were certain things that you knew you wanted from that foreign land. And so that was part of it. So gifts. And the gifts, sometimes they would actually even ask for a particular gift. They would say, in exchange, I would like a statue of such and such, or in exchange, please send me much lapis lazuli, or, they would have a request. Sometimes they just sent it open, like, send me what you have in your land. And that's fine too. So gifts were the third part.
Okay, third part, yeah.
Fourth part was, as you mentioned, marriages. So the kings were often married to one another's daughters. And this was very, very ancient. Again, in Ebla, one of the earliest archives we have, cuneiform archives anywhere in the Middle East, there's records of the king marrying off his daughters to some local, some very distant kings. And these would really cement the alliance between them. And if they were allies, they would each marry one another's daughters. If, though, there was a vassal involved, the interesting thing is that it was better to be the father-in-law. So you might send your daughter to marry your vassal, but you wouldn't accept a daughter from a vassal, because then that makes your vassal your father-in-law, which kind of upsets the hierarchy.
Oh, wow.
So
yeah.
So there were sort of definite sort of lines of who would be okay to marry.
Yeah.
Once these women arrived, they would arrive with huge dowries. They would arrive with many assistants, cooks, all kinds of people who would come with the woman to marry her new husband. And then ideally they would have children, and that would also cement this relationship. And again, from very early on, the kings would say, once one of these marriages had happened, we are one house, we are one family. And they would even sometimes say, your land is my land is now your land. We are brothers. We are not just brothers in the way that, we're allies.
Diplomatically.
Yeah, we are brothers by marriage.
Mhm.
And it seems as though those marriages were really crucial. So that was the fourth part. And then the fifth part were formal peace treaties. And
Oh,
they would draw up, and we know these existed because there is one at Ebla, very, very early on, where the envoys would go back and forth and they would negotiate the terms of the peace treaty. Things like, I will support, if you die first, I will support your chosen heir. If fugitives from your land come to my land, I will send them back to you. If you are attacked, I will come to your defense. There's all kinds of details of these peace treaties. And there's a misapprehension that the earliest peace treaty is very late. People think that the first treaty was between the Egyptians and the Hittites, way at the end of this period in the 13th century. It wasn't. These peace treaties had existed for a very long time before.
interesting.
It was not as well known. And the ones that survive are often not between the great kings. We sometimes have peace treaties between a king and his vassal, or we have a peace treaty between two kings who weren't on the scale of Egypt and Hatti. But we have peace treaties, and we have references to peace treaties. So they seem to have been very, very common in this sort of formal relationship.
That is fascinating. And from everything that you said, one of the things that additional point that I come away with is that these were not just kings given orders. They had a bureaucracy working along with them. This is more sophisticated than we may otherwise think, right?
Oh yes, no, they had many, many officials who worked for them. We know in the 18th century BCE, when they were negotiating peace treaties, the envoys, in this case from the Kingdom of Mari, which is one that we know, they would actually travel back and forth multiple times when a treaty was being negotiated.
Yeah.
They would take, as they called them, little tablets with them, with maybe just one clause of the treaty. Okay, we've worked this out with the king. I'm heading home now. I'm going to talk to my king. Is he okay with this clause? Yeah, he's okay. So you go back and then you do another negotiation. Another small tablet goes back and forth until they've got all these small tablets that then they can put together into one big one. And then the kings would go into a temple to swear that they would abide by the terms of the peace treaty. They never were in the same place. It's not that the kings went to one another's temples. They would go to the temple in their own kingdom, accompanied by the envoys from that foreign kingdom who would attest the fact that the swearing had happened.
And the temples may even have different gods, different religion.
Yes,
right?
yes, right.
Okay.
Not different religions. I'll come back to that point, but they would have different gods, and they would swear by the gods of both their lands. And it was on the peace treaty, it would say this. It would say, for example, by the gods of, Hatti and Babylonia, or whatever it was, whichever kingdoms were creating the treaty, they would say all the gods of both lands are watching over this treaty, which makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Because they have no UN, they don't have a higher authority to sort of impose the treaties. And so they depended on the gods to impose it. And so if anyone went against these treaties, they could expect the gods to punish them. And so they would expect the gods of both lands to sort of collaborate in watching over this. And I think when you said religions, though, I want to add a point here.
Please.
They absolutely believed in one another's gods. This was a time.
Say that again?
Every
Really?
land was polytheistic. There were no false gods. We find no evidence in this period of anyone saying, well, your gods aren't true and our gods are true. They would come to a different land, say they were worshipping the sun god, like in Egypt. Well, there's Ra in Egypt. It's Shamash in Mesopotamia. They don't say, oh, you have a false sun god. They say, oh, we both worship the sun. We call it something different. And so there was a recognition of shared gods, but also you might go to an area, like, for example, in the Middle Euphrates region, which is the region that I've done most of my research on. There's a god named Dagon, who was a god of the sort of an agricultural god. When people encountered the god Dagon, they didn't go, oh, false god Dagon. They would say, oh, a god we don't have. Let's bring him in. And so you see these gods gradually being adopted in other lands. And they didn't have a term for religion. The gods were everywhere. And if you came across people who worship different gods, it wasn't even on their radar to think that gods might be false. It was just gods we didn't know. Great, more gods. And so when they would say the gods of both lands will watch over this treaty, it's like we all believe in all those gods, but we want them all involved so that if you only had the Mesopotamian gods watching over it, perhaps only the Mesopotamian gods would only sort of side with the Mesopotamians. By putting, say, the Hittite gods in there too, you know that the gods will be fair because they will be from both lands, and they were all true.
That is fascinating. Let's take a break here. Stay with me and Dr. Podany as we get into the perspective. Dr. Podany, in the last segment, you started talking about ancient Middle East religious, uh, well, let me just say it this way, lack of strife, religious strife in the ancient Middle East. And I fell silent for several minutes as you were sharing the story. Um, do you have, can we draw any lessons from that time to our current history? Actually, why am I saying current history? The history of the last 600-700 years, all these religious wars. Have you ever thought about that as you were researching?
I have. I think that one thing that um, makes their religions different from modern religions, most modern religions, is that they had no sense of dogma. Religion was just, even the term religion, the gods were just something that existed, that you you grew up with them and they explained everything. And I think it's hard for us to even get our minds around this because that's not how most modern people grow up. If it's raining, they didn't even say it's raining. They would say, they would give the name of the storm god. If the sun rises, they would use the name of the sun god. So that it would, if you were to say, well, there's no sun god, it would be like saying, there's no dog. I see a dog, there's no dog. For them, it was such a clear explanation of their universe that they were gods of everything and that those gods were everywhere all the time. And everything you did was in some way influenced by the fact that you thought that the gods were in charge and the gods were controlling it all. And yet there was no, you must believe this in order to be one of us, sort of dogma type things.
There were no sense of superiority of my God because it's not
No,
dogmatic.
there was a sense of superiority of one particular god over the other. So if you were, especially later with the Assyrians, the god Ashur was supreme, and Ashur could conquer others. So it's not that they felt that gods weren't ranked and somebody's, thought their own god was more powerful. It's just that they never denied the existence of the others. So if Ashur was fighting against Marduk, Ashur, the god of Assyria, is fighting against Marduk, the god of Babylon, nobody's denying that both of those gods exist. They're just, if you're Assyrian, you're thinking, well, my god's going to be more powerful than your god, and therefore we'll probably win this war.
I see.
But interestingly, because they believed in those gods, they would never take the statue of a god and destroy it. Or if they did, it was just unbelievably scary because they believed in that god. And if you took that statue, because they believed the gods actually dwelled inside their statues, you were physically harming that god, and it could definitely get ramifications because that god's going to come back.
Exactly. So I asked you to give us lessons. I'm not sure what lessons we can draw. It's just so different.
So different. That's what I was saying. It is just a completely different conception of the divine and of our relationship to the divine. And the world has changed. I mean, that's one of the ways in which we are dramatically living in a different world today from the one that they lived in. And in part, it's because science has answered many of the questions that they used to simply explain through polytheism, that where they couldn't explain why something happened. When you drop something, it always falls to the ground. We say, well, that's gravity, obviously. Their explanation was, well, that's the gods. Clearly,
oh, wow.
It's the gods doing that.
You said science, but we still believe in religion, and we do a lot of just unbelievable, crazy stuff because of religion.
Yes, I mean, I'm not a religious scholar, and so I don't want to venture too far into that. But when I look at the ancient world, it's interesting in just the very different mindset that they had about the gods. And one example, when I was talking about treaties earlier, when I said that the gods imposed the treaties, there were examples that they could say where it clearly happened. So there was a god named Suppiluliuma, and he broke his treaty with Egypt, and then he died of the plague. And for them, that was cause and effect. It's like, of course, the gods punished him. He broke the treaty with Egypt.
The god died?
No, the king died.
The king died. I was like, what?
No.
What? That's interesting. What lessons can we draw from this period, this golden period of effective diplomacy?
Oh, yeah.
In the Middle East?
The thing that I find so almost inspiring, really, is to realize that human beings were not the way that we tend to think at the beginning of civilization, sort of brutal to one another. They were kind. They were people who cared about justice. They cared about one another. They recognized one another's shared humanity. There was a desire, even amongst those very, very early kings, to get to a peaceful solution before they had to go to war. In the time of the late Bronze Age, there were statements in the peace treaties and in the letters: we great kings desire peace. We want peace between us. And that was heartfelt. That was something that was really, I think, very deeply felt among themselves. I mean, they'd seen war. War was not fun. War was also terribly expensive. And because there was no power among them that was big enough and strong enough and had the effective system to take over everybody else, they were willing to, and not that they didn't try to start with, there was certainly some serious combat during the beginning of the late Bronze Age. But when they realized that it just wasn't going to be possible, they settled into this very comfortable diplomatic relationship, which I think tells us something about human beings that is inspiring. That that perhaps if you go back to sort of first principles of being human, that it's not like we have to force ourselves to be civil, nice people, and we're fighting against our natural instincts. I think what we see from this very early period, this desire for diplomacy, this desire to get along with one another, it suggests that is very intrinsic to being human.
That's such a beautiful message to end this conversation with. So, Dr. Podany, in today's conversation, we talked about the countries and kingdoms of the ancient Middle East. In the next segment of our conversation, we'll talk about the people of the ancient Middle East.